Greetings. Do without wilt should be the whole of the law. I'm Lexi Eve, and welcome back to another episode on Magick Without Tears. Today we're going into chapter 29. What is certainty? Quote, Kara Sora. Well, I suppose I ought to have expected you to cock that wise left eyebrow at me. Right you are to wonder precisely what I mean by certainty in the light of, on soul's curtain is written this one certainty that naught is certain. End quote. So right here, this is today's topic. Basically, how could you be certain of anything when the mind has limitations? What can you be certain of? And what I guess it plays into what is faith, what is doubt. There's a little bit of deep contemplation followed by aha moments and realizations. But whether those realizations are true understanding or are they mental constructs, and differentiating these planes of we have to interpret things with our mind, but there are realms, planes, the supernals above the mind's capability. So what can you actually be certain about? And I think that this plays into a lot with how do you determine your true will when you have to use a mental apparatus which is not perfect and misses a huge chunk of the reality of existence? And how do you do the great work in that light? So, moving on, the above quote on soul's curtain is written this one certainty that naught is certain. So this is from a poem by Crowley from the Garden of Janus. In this chapter, he immediately references the Book of Lies. Quote, then there is that chapter in the Book of Lies, chapter 45, Chinese music. The Chinese cannot help thinking that the octave has 5 notes. The more necessary anything appears to my mind, the more certain it is that I only assert a limitation. I slept with fate and found a corpse in my arms on waking. I drank and danced all night with doubt and found her a virgin in the morning. End quote. So here, let me give a quick note. Music that we use today still follows the pretty much general layout set forth by Pythagoras and expounded upon by many a musician after. In Western music, there are usually 7 notes. The Chinese traditionally use a pentatonic scale of 5 notes. Each of these scales breed their own style. So if you listen to traditional Chinese music, it has a specific rhythm. If you listen to classical or traditional European music, it has a specific style and rhythm. And to both of these cultures that developed these music systems, each seemed absolutely essential to the people creating these mathematical systems way back when. The entirety of the Book of Lies is essential to this chapter because it deals with interpretation of the infinite, which is beyond the abyss, and thus not capable of being rationalized by the conscious mind and its limitations. Still, we need labels to communicate effectively, and thought has its own realm where we as humans operate socially below the abyss. For those few who ascend to the supernals, they live in this state of samadhi and beyond, yet cannot disseminate accurately through words the experience or observations that they have above the abyss to any minds below the abyss. Still, the masters leave breadcrumbs which may be followed. So the Book of Lies deals with this problem. To boil it down, because anything which can be observed is below the abyss, it is a reflection of reality and not the true thing. Because above the abyss, all is in union, and we know from many past talks on this and Crowley's writings, my lectures, 0 equals 2. So above the abyss, everything's in union, it equals 0, and by the union of opposites canceling out anything which can be observed, there is naught. Thus can it have no label, which is used to differentiate it from some other thing. If you give anything a label, it is inherently distinct, and because there is no distinction above the abyss, no labels will suit it. Therefore, the full title of the Book of Lies is Liber 333, which I'll mention later on, but it's the Book of Lies, which is also falsely called Breaks, the wanderings or falsifications of the one thought of Frater Perdurabo, Aleister Crowley, which thought is itself untrue. That's the full title. This is saying what I just said in a different, more poetic way. Any thought is a break from samadhi, the purest form of concentration, and thus union, where thought ceases. And again, because any thought occurs by experience, rationality, and observation, it is inherently not true, but still necessary, as we have bodies which reside below the abyss and still have to operate not only above but also below. So, if you read through this Libra 333, which is the number of the keeper of the abyss, the gap between the supernal and rational realms, in light of the chapters mentioned being but shadows of the supernal reality, you will be able to see the attitude of the master who has bridged the gap, as well as the reflection of what is above by usage and description of the lower. So let's here continue with chapter 29 of Magick Without Tears. Crowley reminds the reader of a poem, Hymn to St. Thomas, quote, "Doubt, doubt thyself, doubt even if thou doubtest thyself, doubt all, doubt even if thou doubtest all." So it's continuing a quote here. "It seems sometimes as if beneath all conscious doubt there lay some deepest certainty. Oh, kill it, slay the snake. The horn of the doubt goat be exalted. Dive deeper, ever deeper into the abyss of mind, until thou unearth that fox, that. On hounds, yoicks, tally-ho, bring that to bay." End quote. So for Crowley, art, and poetry was his form of art, expresses the unconscious by unconventional linguistic means, which is why he references yet another prose poem, and why most of the Book of Lies is in prose poetry. He says, dive deeper into the mind, indicating perhaps the unconscious mind, or perhaps going so far into the conscious mind that one exposes its contradictions, in which case they learn not to trust the mind on its merits. He uses the symbolism of chasing a fox to describe chasing thought, or the root of thought. The fox is a mercurial beast, fast and cunning, a chicken coop sneak, a thief. Many mythologies around the world sprang up about mythical beasts which resemble a fox. Across cultures, the fox is always either a trickster, a wise spirit, or a guide. Mercury the child, Mercury the magus, or Mercury the hermit. And note that the second highest grade of AA is the magus, which still must be won out and overcome by the abscissimus. The magus speaks, the magister delivers, but the abscissimus is silent. To continue, Crowley mentions that Libra 333 opens with a question mark on one page and an exclamation point on the next, and recommends reading The Soldier and the Hunchback, which carries the idea over of every question has an answer and every answer leads to more questions, ultimately that information is limitless, thus knowledge is the trap of the abyss. Still, we need information for the sake of life and the will of the magician to its many ends, so we should approach all knowledge with skepticism and caution. With The Soldier and the Hunchback, there's also the question mark represents this, I want to understand. So you're questioning reality, you're questioning, religion, God, the divine, what is it? And you're contemplating, and the exclamation point is the aha moment of when you finally got it, and that comes with, for most people, many, many years of study and practice. There are also, worth mentioning, there are several schools of philosophical skepticism, and I find Plato's the most approachable and grounded, positing that we cannot know anything with certainty, strictly opposing the idea that certain truth is attainable by humans. It's used in academics most commonly, and it says that because of human nature, you really can't understand certain things about reality. So my rebuttal is that then, as a magician who would know truth, that magician should try to be more than human. For philosophies on skepticism, I suggest reading Pyrrho, Descartes, and David Hume. They all have some good skepticism philosophy. To continue, we're going to jump ahead through the chapter. Quote, "Off we jogged to the divine Pymander, who saw and stated the quiddity of our query. With his accustomed lucidity, he discerns the 3 degrees of truth, and he distinguishes accordingly. True, certain without error, of all truth. Clear enough, the difference between 1 and 2. Ask me the time, I say 2:30, and that's true enough. But the astronomer royal is by no manner of means satisfied with any approximation of that kind. He wants it accurate. He must know the longitude to a second. He must have decided what method of measuring time is to be used. He must make corrections for this and for that. And he must have attached an arbitrary interpretation to the system. The whole question of relativity pops up. And, even so, he will enter a caveat about every single ganglion in the gossamer of his calculations. Well then, all this intricate differentiation and integration and verification and Lord knows what leads at last to a statement which may be called certain without error, end quote. So this is a point of verbal differentiation I neglected in my Emerald Tablet video. Those words, true, certain without error of all truth, is one possible translation of the opening passage of the Emerald Tablet. So it's the very first thing that you read. What appears to be a singular statement, Crowley breaks down into 3 categories. The first, true. That is the absolute. Nothing else need be said. It's one singular true. Second is certain without error. And that's the mental interpretation of truth and holds that the interpretation is correct. And finally, of all truth, that's the third statement, of all truth, refers to the singular truth as broken down into parts, duality from singularity. There are many little truths, and they all are comprised in this one truth. Finally, what Crowley says by analogy is that we must be precise from the largest scale to the smallest degree in our interpretation of nature. This requires specialized tools to do so in science. That tool for the occultist is the well-tuned and disciplined mind, one which fully understands its limited capabilities in regards to the supernal realm. The next paragraph states that the astronomer may only make calculations based on measurements and by putting their object of measurement in relation with something else. Quote, but Hermes Trismegistus is not content with any such fuge as the astronomer, however cunning and colossal his organ. His third degree demands much more than this. The relations measured by the astronomer simply doesn't matter to anybody apart from that particular case. It is not of all truth, end quote. So what's being said here is that while science has its own place and does create marvels of its own, it has rules grounded in a saya, which simply do not allow for the figuring or understanding out of the true nature of reality. When science hits that veil, it bounces back, unable to penetrate. Hermeticism, on the other hand, does not have that problem so far as understanding reality, existence, the divine, creation of the universe, etc. Quote, I think that Hermes was contemplating a ruach closely knitted together and anchored by incessant aspiration to the supernal triad. Just such an one, in short, as appears in those remarks on the magical memory, a god-man ready to discard his well-worn instrument for a new one, brought up to date with all the latest improvements, the movement of the zeitgeist during the past incarnation in particular, well wrought and ready for his use. This being so, a truth which is of all truth should mean any proposition which forms an essential part of his coup, this magical identity of a man, end quote. For every preponderance, with ample search and contemplation, there inevitably arrives an earth-shaking aha realization. But this is still limited to the mental plane. Quote, there's always the way out from the question mark to the exclamation point, as with any and every intellectual problem whatsoever. The more certain I am of anything, the more certain it is that I am only asserting a limitation of my own mind. Very good, but what am I to do about it? Some, at least, of such certainties must surely be of all truth. The test of admission to this class ought to be that, if one were to accept the contradictory of the proposition, the entire structure of the mind would be knocked into pieces, as it is not at all the case with the astronomer's determination, which may turn out to be wrong for a dozen different reasons without anybody getting seriously wounded in his tenderest feelings. The master of the temple deals very simply and efficiently with problems of this kind. The mind, says he, of this party of the first, true, herein referred to as Frater n, or whatever his 8th degree equals 3 square motto may be, is so constructed that the interval from C to C, and I'm pretty sure that's Kelvin to, or centigrade to Celsius, C to C, is most harmoniously divided into n notes. That of the party of the second, certain, right? That was the second part from that Emerald Tablet statement, certain without error, being that lower human nature, Mr. Smith. The structure called of all truth is neither of us is affected in the least, any more than in the reading of a thermometer with Fahrenheit on one side and centigrade on the other, end quote. So maybe this statement is a little convoluted at first, but to translate, the master acknowledges that which is beyond their realm of Bina, that which is in Bina, that which is below Bina, all within their own being. That when one is interacted upon, it changes all simultaneously, and that you can see the changes physically on the lower, and thus extrapolate what is going on in this higher, and also understand that there is a portion, the true, which is never affected whatsoever. Quote, you naturally object that this answer is little better than an evasion, that it automatically pushes the gamut question outside the charmed of all truth circle. No, it doesn't really, for if you were able to put up a projection of those two minds, there would be, firstly, some sort of compensation elsewhere than in the musical section, and secondly, some truth of yet a higher order which is common to both, end quote. So like I previously said, the lower intellectual part of the soul is a reflection of the higher intuitive part of the soul, and these internal categories are synonymous with the external universal planes. There's a common link between the internal and the external, yet they differ in tangibility and how one perceives them. So it's like a paradox that study and experience alone clears up. It's kind of like if you want to study occultism, study psychology of consciousness. If you want to understand the psyche, study the occult science of Kabbalah. They kind of go hand in hand at certain points, and then eventually diverge into what they can allow one to command and comprehend, experiment upon. And ultimately, even psychology is in its infancy, so I'm talking more about like introspection and understanding how your mind works. I think psychology is a great means for that, but again, it's a limited science. Study Kabbalah is ultimately what I'm saying, but there's a little paradox there. You do need to understand how your brain works, a little bit of biology, a little bit of psychology, and then come back to Kabbalah. Quote, not unaware am I that these conceptions are at first exceedingly difficult to formulate clearly. I wouldn't go so far as to say that one would have to be a master of the temple to understand them, but it is really very necessary to have grasped firmly the doctrine that a thing is only true insofar as it contains its contradiction in itself. A good way to realize this is by keeping up a merry dance of paradoxes, such as infest logic and mathematics. The repeated butting of the head against a brick wall is bound in the long run to shake up the little gray cells, teach you to distrust any train of argument, however apparently impeccable the syllogisms, and to seek ever more eagerly the dawn of the neshchamanic consciousness where all these things are clearly understood, although impossible to express in rational language, end quote. And so here we're almost done with the chapter. Quote, the prime function of the intellect is differentiation. It deals with marks, with limits, with the relations of what is not identical. In the neshchama, all this work has been carried out so perfectly that the rough working has passed clean out of mind. Just so, you say I, as if it were an indivisible unity, unconscious of the inconceivably intricate machinery of anatomical, physiological, psychological construction which issues in this idea of I, end quote. The mechanisms of the brain, which is, again, limited by differentiation, how it observes external objects, separation, is itself, the brain is itself composed of too numerous parts to count, which is ironic, right? It interprets this one true, this ultimate non-being of truth, through various means when it itself is composed of various means. So no wonder the mind sees its own ego as both individual and yet a complete unity. Finally, what we can say with certainty, Crowley states in the closing paragraph, quote, "We may then with some confidence reaffirm that our certainties do assert our limitations." I'm going to repeat that. We may then with some confidence reaffirm that our certainties do assert our limitations. But this kind of limitation is not necessarily harmful, provided that we view the situation in its proper perspective, that we understand that membership of the of all truth class does not, as one is apt to think at first sight, deepen the gulfs which separate mind from mind, but on the contrary put us in a position to ignore them. Our acts of love under will, which express our devotion to Nuit, which multiply the fulfillments of our possibilities, become continually more efficacious and more closely bound up with our formula of initiation, and we progressively become aware of deeper and vaster images of the of all truth class, which reconcile by including within themselves all apparent antinomies. It is certain without error that I ought to go to bed. End quote. Love is the law. Love under will. Catch y'all in the next one.